The next speaker we have is Dr. Amy Lightbody. She's a senior research associate in the Center for Interdisciplinary Brain Sciences Research.
Okay, thank you. It's great to have everyone here. I actually got home late last night from Cincinnati with the Fragile X Clinical and Research Consortium's All Clinics meeting. So that's a group of clinics throughout the country who are coming together to kind of create a standard of care and hopefully enough clinics that families can drive within driving distance to get care that specializes in Fragile X syndrome, as well as a group who's putting together a pretty large database of some key variables on Fragile X syndrome. I think they reported that there are over 800 individuals with Fragile X in the database now. So that's pretty exciting because we're starting to look at that data. And then to be able to come here and hear all these wonderful talks on such a wide variety of research going on with Fragile X syndrome is really great. So today I'm going to talk a bit about a method for looking at social gaze in Fragile X syndrome as a potential outcome measure that for behavioral interventions or clinical trials that we've been using in our lab. So in general, in the field, there is kind of an overarching need for valid, reliable, and meaningful outcome measures for studying clinical trials on both behavioral interventions as well as medications. And there is a lack of those types of, kind of solid outcome measures, specifically addressing social functioning. And so we've used eye tracking as one of the methods to kind of think about how social interaction goes with eye gaze and what that looks like in Fragile X syndrome and in comparison to other types of groups. So when you think about eye contact, it's kind of a natural instinct in humans to want to look at another person and kind of engage with them in that way. And there's a lot of important information that's gained from using eye contact. So development of language, recognizing the emotions of other people, learning through joint attention and other aspects of kind of learning new skills and new information, and a general social engagement that comes from making eye contact with another person. And that in turn then leads to being able to kind of regulate that interaction and understand another person's signals, kind of monitor the flow of conversation, and take in that nonverbal information. So we know that eye gaze aversion is one of the hallmark symptoms of having Fragile X syndrome. And so when you think about someone kind of potentially losing a lot of this type of information, that can be a critical aspect of their development and their learning. So it's kind of an interesting symptom to think about in terms of what that means for an individual and how important it could be or not to kind of train that type of eye contact, but at least to understand what's going on with it. So previous literature looking at eye gaze in Fragile X has used some different methodologies. So in terms of thinking of an interaction with another person, Cohen has done several studies with parent-child interactions and then coding from videotape what the eye contact looks like or the eye gaze. So they've looked at when the parent looks at the child, when the child looks at the parent, when they look at each other, or when they're not looking at all. And one of the studies in particular is kind of doing that within the construct of doing a task with each other. And then in our lab, we've used another type of social interaction, which will be similar to the one I'll talk about today, but then coding the eye gaze from video as well, and using corresponding psychophysiological data. And the results of that showed that individuals with Fragile X actually engage in eye gaze aversion about 90% of the time during the social interaction, whereas typically developing siblings were engaging in eye gaze aversion about 10% of the time. So a pretty big difference. And with the Fragile X group, there were elevated psychophysiological outcomes as well that corresponded to that eye gaze aversion. So an indication that there is anxiety potentially related to making eye contact. And then other studies have actually used eye tracking devices, which I'll talk about, to monitor eye contact in real time and eye gaze and where that's, where people are looking at a given point in time. And in this case, they've used static images presented on a computer screen of human faces depicting emotion and looked at, through the eye tracking data, where a person is looking on the face during those pictures. And so individuals in these studies have with Fragile X are looking less than typically developing individuals at the eye region specifically, and looking more at the lower part of the face or not at the face at all. So the project I'm going to describe actually kind of melds both of those strategies and incorporates a face-to-face interaction using conversation, where the experimenter is asking questions of the individual with Fragile X and hoping that they answer, and using a sort of pre-designated set of questions, and topics, but also letting the conversation flow in somewhat of a natural manner so that you can hopefully engage the individual in a topic that's interesting to them, so that the conversation will flow as kind of naturally as possible. And then we have a group of individuals with Fragile X, and then we also are comparing them to a group of individuals matched on age and developmental level, as well as some behavioral characteristics. So we're wondering whether this type of situation can be used as so can we measure eye gaze in a naturalistic setting? Can we take this eye tracking data and kind of have it be effective within a natural in-person type of dynamic? And if so, where are individuals with Fragile X looking when they're engaged in this type of conversation? And how does that compare to individuals with similar developmental levels and behavioral characteristics? And then, of course, what's the impact of those characteristics on their use of eye gaze? So the individuals in this study were both males and females between the ages of 12 and 28. They were participating in a larger longitudinal study of Fragile X syndrome. And this was one of the tasks that we did with them while they were visiting Stanford. So as I mentioned, there were two groups, Fragile X group, and then this sort of age, developmental level, and symptom-matched control group. There were 51 individuals with Fragile X syndrome and 19 individuals with in the control group. And the groups did not differ on these various characteristics. So you can see here the average age was around 20. The Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale is the VABS, so that's the composite overall score, as well as the subdomain scores, and there were no differences between the groups on those measures. And then the autistic symptoms were measured by the Social Communication Questionnaire, so the SCQ, and that's their mean levels of reported symptoms of autism on that questionnaire. Okay, so this is the groups overall, the Fragile X group versus the control group. And then this is just the breakdown of males and females within each of the two groups. So in the control group, there were no differences on these measures between boys and girls. In the Fragile X group, as might be expected, the boys had lower levels of functioning than the girls, which is anticipated as a result of kind of the way Fragile X works. So our eye tracker is a Tobii X120. It is a freestanding device that allows for some level of natural head movement within the tracking of the eyes. And it allows for a custom setup. So it sits on a table, and you can see a depiction of our experimental design here. The experimenter and the participant are sitting across from each other with the eye tracker in between them facing the participant. There's a camera mounted on the eye tracker which records the participant's face, and then there's what's called the scene camera, which is sitting behind the participant, which is recording the experimenter's face, which is essentially the platform for the eye tracking. So when the person comes in to participate, they sit down at the table and we ask them to do the calibration, and there's a calibration board that has points on it that they're instructed to look at the points when we tell them to, and that's how we calibrate that. And that process can be easy or difficult depending on just cooperation and level of eye gaze, but pretty often, even if it takes several tries, we can get pretty good calibration data. And then once the eye tracker is calibrated to that individual, they can then look wherever they want, and the eye tracker will catch that. So the experimenter would engage in a 10-minute conversation on familiar topics, and we were prompting for eye contact approximately every 30 seconds. So something like, oh, remember to keep looking at me, because their instructions were to try to maintain eye contact with the examiner during the task. If they were already looking, we would say something like, good job looking, and continue on with the conversation. So to analyze the data, we utilize an automatic face detection program developed by our colleagues in psychology and computer science. The way the software works is to map key points on images of the examiner, and those key points are then grouped to create regions of interest. So the regions of interest that we focused on were the face as a whole, and then the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the jaw. So this is me. I was one of the main experimenters, and you can see hopefully the red dot. That's an example of one of the key points that would have been mapped onto my face or whoever's face was the person doing the task. And then this is an example of the heat maps showing the density of fixation. So warmer colors show more fixation for representative. This is a representative, 3 individuals with Fragile X and then 3 individuals with developmental delays. And the circles show the grouped key points for the region of interest analysis. So we calculated the total time that people spent looking at the face as a whole, as well as the time spent in the individual ROIs. And we also calculated the average time they spent looking in any given episode of looking at the person, the experimenter, and then the time in between their episodes of looking. So this graph table shows the total sample, so the Fragile X group versus the control group. And so you can see that the proportion of gaze was overall lower for the group with Fragile X, specifically for the face as a whole, as well as the eyes and the nose and the mouth. There was no significance for the jaw, but overall that was not a big focus for the eye contact, for the gaze looking across either of the groups. And then looking at episode length, so the amount of time in any given kind of look up at the person, look away, was much shorter for the individuals with Fragile X than the controls. And then the time in between episodes of eye gaze or face gaze, or wherever they happen to look in that general direction, was also longer for the group of Fragile X. So the takeaway is that individuals with Fragile X are looking less at any part of the face. And they're looking for shorter periods of time, and there's more space in between those episodes of looking. This just shows the same metrics, but broken down within group between boys and girls. So in the control group, there was no difference between boys and girls on any of these metrics, but for the Fragile X group, there were differences between the males and females for some of the metrics, particularly the looking at the face and the eyes and the nose, so the general kind of upper region of the face, and then the episode lengths and the time in between. So the girls, as you might expect, were sort of making more eye contact than the boys, or looking longer than the boys. And then we just looked at the effect of some of the characteristics on social gaze. So for the group with Fragile X, their communication score on the Vineland adaptive behavior scales was had a significant impact on the amount of eye gaze during the conversation task, which is kind of interesting because it is a conversation task. So just kind of thinking about how having to look and talk and do all those things at the same time might play a significant role in that social communication and the way you utilize eye contact. And for the controls, interestingly, it was actually their symptoms of autism that were that had the more significant impact on whether or not they looked at the experimenter during the task. So more symptoms, less looking for that group. So in conclusion, we feel that this method for analyzing and kind of examining social gaze in individuals with Fragile X and really anybody is a good method, and it works. You can kind of look at this type of situation in a more naturalistic way, and could possibly be utilized as an outcome measure that might be sensitive to these types of changes for a given intervention. And overall, individuals with Fragile X have the most difficulty looking at the eyes and nose region relative to controls, and spend less time looking overall than at the face than do controls. The episodes of looking are shorter duration, and the time between episodes of looking is longer for individuals with Fragile X. And as I just mentioned, communication ability seems to have an impact on that as well. Whereas for controls, it was more related to their behaviors and their specifically symptoms of autism. So some of the directions we'd like to go in the future, we're actually using a similar paradigm in a study, the study that Jennifer talked about earlier of longitudinal brain development in young children with Fragile X syndrome. So we're collecting similar eye tracking data with a task that is within a conversation setting. It's a slightly more scripted task in that we kind of go through the topics in a specific order, so there might be a little bit more, some of the reviews of the paper that this current study is based on asked about that, about how structured the task was and whether the topics mattered. So we've tried to keep that a little more consistent, but still keeping a naturalistic feel with this younger group of children. And this group is actually just exactly the kind of group younger than the ones in the study I just talked about. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out in a younger population. And we have a typically developing group as well as this kind of developmental behavior matched group to kind of see what does eye contact in a young group of children who are typically developing look like. Because, adult eye contact might be quite, we've kind of learned that that's an important part of functioning, but young children are still probably kind of cluing into that and learning how to use that. So looking at the way that shapes up in typically developing individuals will help better understand where this is headed with Fragile X and kids with autism. And we also have this brain data that Jennifer mentioned that we can hopefully utilize as well in kind of thinking about, either their early brain development and what that looks like for their eye gaze later on. And we also have simultaneous, brain data from the visit where we're collecting this data as well. So other ways we can look at this data is to think about what the eye gaze looks like given who's talking. So do people look more when they are talking, or do they look more when the other person is talking? And what would happen if there was a condition where the experimenter is actually not looking, but looking out of the way of eye contact, and does the person on the other side of the table look more or less in that situation? And then just further evaluation of this method in general in terms of test-retest reliability, and kind of how we can effectively use this going forward as an outcome measure. And that's it. I don't have a thank you slide, but I should mention that Dr. Scott Hall is the first author on a paper that is submitted and has been reviewed and resubmitted, so that should hopefully be accepted soon, and you'll be able to read more about the details forthcoming on this. And
Hi, Amy. That was really nice. I think a lot of people have a lot of hopes for eye tracking as a potential outcome measure, and so the question I had was whether we have any clues as to whether eye tracking is a potentially drug responsive outcome measure. Has anybody used it in a trial for autism or Fragile X and actually seen that move?
right, so as far as I know, yes. Oh, yes, we did. Yes, we did, but have we, I don't know, have we looked at that data yet? Okay, so we do have a drug trial, that double-blind drug trial that utilized the same paradigm as an outcome measure, and it's to be examined.
So
to be
let
determined.
me just say a couple of things. One, a study that was really designed and implemented by Scott did a behavioral intervention for eye contact and showed in what you might consider to be very hardened gaze averters with Fragile X that behavioral intervention can make a significant difference in gaze. And in our oxytocin trial, which may be the only, well, maybe not the only, but it may be one of the only medications to actually show a significant effect in Fragile X syndrome. We just did a 2-dosage trial, but we actually have Scott is talking about this in Bethesda today, I think, or tomorrow. Eye gaze was one of the outcome measures that responded. So yes, the answer is yes. And that was eye gaze as measured by a much more clumsy method than this automated measure, which we think will be a lot more sensitive. So yeah, this could be one of those things, Mike, that you were talking about that's more free-ranging, that you can track over time. I just heard, just so you know, for all the people interested in eye gaze, I heard this report on NPR, the greatest source of news, scientific news. So where this one company is building an iPad-based measure of eye gaze, so it actually is looking at your eye gaze as well as supposedly your emotional response to what is being presented on your iPad. So if we could get to that point where you get that level of automatized data from an iPad, you'd have to have some sort of realistic, ecologically valid stimuli on your iPad, to have it be a reasonable outcome measure. But yeah, I think there's lots of movement in this area and we're really interested in this, as you can tell, as well.
So just a segue on that, Google Glass actually tracks eyes natively. It's part of the interface.
Let me comment on that. It's terrible. It's lousy. It's not good at it.
As a product,
okay,
yes.
I just want to tell you. So we actually have we just got some sophisticated eye tracking glasses from, where did we get ours from?
Yeah.
SMI. Yeah. So we have a different project involving ambulatory near-infrared spectroscopy, functional imaging, and so this one is like 2 orders of magnitude better than the Google Glass, just so you know. But yes, I think people are interested in this very, very broadly in marketing.
Well, and there are a lot of interesting applications of the eye tracking. What we like about the freestanding one is that it doesn't go on anyone's head, and so, because that can be intrusive for individuals with disabilities, and so having it kind of sitting there and, it's still a little bit of a kind of not supernatural environment, but at least it leads to a little more kind of naturalistic, I don't have some weird thing on my head right now, kind of concept.
Hello. So this is just sort of a comment. That was wonderful. I'm a parent of a child with Fragile X, and the eye gaze is something that is mentioned to us from day one, from the diagnosis, and we've actually written out of our son's IEPs, if any of you know what that is. It's the individual educational plan, to not force our child to have eye gaze. My son can either learn something or have eye contact, cannot do both. And so it's a very frustrating thing for teachers to overcome their bias towards look at me so I can teach you. Mm-hmm. So we have found that my son learns if you sit next to him and present the information that he needs to learn next to him. And I, as a parent, noticed, just in another commentary about eye gaze, is that for me, it's very obvious that eye gaze for my son is hyperstimulatory. It produces anxiety and also arousal to a very great degree. I don't know why that is. I guess you're trying to figure that out, and I appreciate that very much. But for instance, my son likes to watch. He has his own iPad, and he finds his own videos, and he's actually quite skilled at that. But there's one in particular that he watches over and over, the stereotypical pathway. Of a child's eyes, baby Einstein. There's a picture, a close-up of a baby's face. It is just a beautiful face, and he can spend days looking at that face. So it's interesting, the sort of the dichotomy of the anxiety production from the living being's eyes contacts versus the somewhat static eye. And it does, he just loves that baby's face. But in terms of interactions on a social level, when my son is sad or scared or hurt, he looks me straight in the eyes and is up close. And so, but on a day-to-day basis for functioning, yeah, he does not look our way.
Well, I do think there's a lot of sort of information, or just kind of anecdotally or both through research, about, kind of what is the use in Fragile X of eye contact. And, it doesn't it feels different than the eye gaze aversion that you see in autism. There still is this social component, but it's utilized in a slightly different way than with typical development, and kind of how that works, and what should we force and what shouldn't we, in terms of shaping eye contact. And if you noticed, one of Dr. Hall's upcoming grants is on shaping eye contact and kind of what that means. And so
I just want to make one last comment, and we'll move on. It's a great discussion, and it relates to what Jennifer was saying. You might remember, Amy, one of the moms that came in our early study of the first round of our early childhood study was a mom with a full mutation, and had made it through junior college and was working, but she described herself as a child, and of course, the eye contact issues in girls with the full mutation are present. They're significant, but they're more subtle frequently than what you see in boys. So she had said, when we were just talking in our one of the rooms, and she was telling me about her childhood, and she said, I had a terrible time with eye contact. Do you remember this, Mom?
Oh yeah, definitely.
A terrible time. And I said, well, you're certainly looking at me now really wonderfully. And so when I talked with her, she said 2 really, really interesting things. So, of course, most boys with Fragile X syndrome can't tell you why they turn away. They just do it. But girls and women can tell you oftentimes. And this young mom was very articulate, and she said, it's too much information. It's too much information. The face, the gaze, the body posture, the speech, everything. It's just overwhelming information, and the way, from her perspective, this is an N of 1, but I've heard this other times as well, the only way to reduce the amount of that incoming information that makes me uncomfortable is to turn away. So she said it was a terrible problem for her. How did she, do you remember how she said she had an uncle who told her, and of course this probably doesn't work in too many people, you have to stop that because people are not going to pay attention to you, or they're going to think that you're not paying attention to them. It was kind of, they were in a Midwest farming community, and basically that was the behavioral intervention. You got to stop that. But it's apparently a very caring uncle, and she listened to him, and she basically over the years taught herself to be able to make eye contact. And I said, so what is it like right now? She goes, it's really hard right now, with you right now, but I can do it. So just as an anecdote that supports your hypothesis about this, Jennifer, I think that's probably right.
Yeah, sure.
It might be interesting, I think. I'm also a parent. It might be interesting along the lines of too much information. I've seen my son and other children with Fragile X be able, not eye gaze, but be able to scan an environment really for a brief time and be able to relate a whole lot of detail from what they've seen, so that it might somehow be interesting to, I'm hearing you say that communication definitely is affected and correlates to eye gaze, but how could you factor in? It might be interesting to look at how you could factor in their overall ability to scan, and that they're probably getting, how much of that information are they getting in that brief time, not how does it affect, because the communication might be affected anyway. So kind of what he said is what I was saying.
I agree with you, and
but that was
especially
just
in this
interesting.
particular section, I think that it's the communication that is then influencing their ability to continue this process. But there are so many aspects of, you know, the way people can learn without, you know, doing this particular, or, you know, what part of the face. So, okay, we're not looking at the eyes, but from here, can you tell whether I'm looking at your eyes or not? You know, and that may not matter. And if it's less aversive to watch someone's mouth, and that might facilitate communication anyway. You know, there's other ways to kind of, you know, perhaps shape up some of the social needs that come from eye gaze, but still keep the learning and the anxiety levels down. So, just things to think about for the future. Thank you.